Greetings to the patrons of the Chesterfield Public Library System, and happy Juneteenth. My name is Nathan Richardson, and I am a poet, a published author, and Frederick Douglass historian. I have been for the past 7 years studying the life and times and narratives of Frederick Douglass and bringing him to life in living history. And so I'm very happy today that your library system has asked me to have a conversation with you about this important holiday that some of you may or may not be familiar with, called Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the official end of slavery in the United States of America. Now, some of you might say, well, I thought that the end of slavery was marked by the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, yes, that is true, but you may not be aware of the history that the Emancipation Proclamation did not reach Galveston, Texas, the southernmost state in the Union, until June the 19th of 1865. So what we're going to do today, starting out in short order with a brief narrative of not just the ending of slavery, because we can't end something before we begin it. And so we're going to talk very briefly about the beginning of slavery on this continent. And then we'll move through to the founding of the country, to the Civil War, to the Emancipation, and to Juneteenth. Now, slavery on this continent started around the year 1619 when a ship, a Portuguese ship bound for Mexico with about 19 or some odd Angolans from Africa, was commandeered, and that ship, that cargo, that living cargo, was rerouted to Virginia and the colonies here. That ship arrived at a place called Port Comfort. Now, Port Comfort is now what we know as Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. And there is Fort Monroe, and the Casemate Museum. It's actually held by the National Park Service, and you can go there and find out more about Fort Monroe and the history of how that fort played a part in the Civil War. And there's actually a marker along the shore of the Chesapeake Bay that marks 1619 and the point where those first 19 or so Africans arrived at Port Comfort. Now, they were taken from that ship and taken into the interior of Virginia to colonies like Jamestown settlement and Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, and Yorktown. And these people were put into bondage, into outright slavery, and some into indentured servitude. There's not much record of many of them making it out of their bondage, although at that time slavery was not a codified institution, and so some, as a matter of fact, there's the account that one of the couples gave birth to a son named William, who was the first African born in America as a free person. And so, as time goes on, 250 years before we have 13 colonies who now starting to recognize that they want their independence from Britain, that this institution of slavery is becoming more and more codified into the fabric of the country. And that's because, of course, we're building, the settlers are building a nation, and they need labor, and the Indians are not too keen on helping them build this America that they see. Well, by the time 1776 and the Revolutionary War, and we established our independence from Great Britain, There are a number of free blacks in the country, and as a matter of fact, they fought in the Revolutionary War to help found the country. You see in the books accounts of people like the Black Minutemen of Massachusetts, Crispus Attucks, who was the first black man to be killed in the Revolutionary War. Even women like Mom Bet fought in the Revolutionary War. And right here in this area of Hampton Roads, Virginia, a very famous man, Billy Flora, who was a blacksmith in the Great Bridge area, fought in the Battle of Great Bridge. He laid down his hammer and anvil and picked up a weapon to fight for the founding of this country. And so we have, in 1776, the establishment of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But unfortunately, slavery becomes more and more an institution that is codified and supported by law. And the brutality of slavery becomes an atrocious contradiction to the Constitution. And the debate about this contradiction goes on and gets worse and becomes more intense until in 1861, the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And the Civil War starts to finally end this debate on whether the institution of slavery will remain a part and a contradiction to our Constitution. Well, the abolitionists of the time, William Lloyd Garrison, the Quakers, and many other religious denominations saw that this slavery was not something that they wanted to support, and so they worked with abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman in all sorts of ways, including the Underground Railroad, to help those people in bondage, those colored people in bondage, escape and fight for the freedom of their fellow men and women in bondage. Now, of course, Frederick Douglass was right at the forefront of this, and he and many others started lobbying Abraham Lincoln to recognize that colored people, just like they did in the Revolutionary War, could be assets and fight for to save the Union. It was something that, of course, that Abraham Lincoln considered, but was in a political wedge, so to speak, in which he could not just do that, but he did. His main purpose was to save the Union. And so eventually, after several things happened, they finally added colored soldiers to the Union, to the fight in the Civil War, in which this war, pitting Americans against themselves. More than 800,000 Americans dying in this conflict. And with Frederick Douglass insisting that black men fight and represent the country, Abraham Lincoln eventually saw that this was prudent. He was pushed on by, believe it or not, we're coming right back to Fort Monroe, and a general by the name of Butler, who was commander of Fort Monroe at the time, wrote an edict which gave colored people an out. It said that any colored person who escaped from their masters could, if they made it to Fort Monroe, could claim themselves as contraband of the war, and that they would be protected and not sent back to their masters. And so now you have a mass exodus of colored men and women and their children, if they could do that, running away from their masters. As a matter of fact, one of the ones that I really a story that I really admire here in this area is the story of Martha Ann Fields, who was a enslaved woman with 10 children and a husband in Hanover County. And she took 6 of her children and a couple of other children and made her way from Hanover County to Fort Monroe. That's almost 100 miles. It would have taken her at least 2 or 3 days to walk from Hanover County to Fort Monroe. Now, after the Civil War, one of her sons, William, went to Hampton Institute, which is right there in Hampton, went on to Cornell University, became a lawyer, returned to Virginia, and practiced law, and became a state representative in the Virginia legislature. So this is an incredible, rich history of Africans, black people, colored people, in their quest for freedom in this country. So we have the Civil War raging and hundreds of thousands of Americans dying, and Abraham Lincoln with the dilemma of how to end the war and save the Union. And he did this through what we now know as the Emancipation Proclamation. He delayed and delivered and thought and rewrote and redrafted this document until he had something that he thought could stand the test of time. And on the first day of January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And people all over the country were waiting to see what this proclamation would say and what it would mean. Now, what I'm going to do is just read a short bit of the Emancipation Proclamation and kind of give you an explanation of why some parts of it are controversial and why we are still in somewhat of a debate these days about whether the Emancipation Proclamation actually freed the slaves. It starts here by saying a proclamation, whereas on the 22nd day of September in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit: that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. So he's starting out in the opening paragraph for the proclamation, giving notice to America that slavery will end and that those people in bondage will be emancipated. Now, as people started their jubilant celebration, Frederick Douglass was actually in Massachusetts at the time, waiting on the telegram about the Emancipation Proclamation, and there was great jubilation and celebration. But then they started to read the Declaration, the Proclamation, to find out exactly what it said, and there were some questions that came up. Now, I'm just going to read another part of the Emancipation Proclamation and give you kind of an explanation about what the strategy of Abraham Lincoln was in drafting the document in this way. Further down in the proclamation, it reads, "For the full period of 100 days, from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people of their respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Proclemens, St. John, John, St. Charles, St. James Assumption, Terrebonne. And then he names other states. And in the border states, like, for example, the 48 counties of West Virginia, and also Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as this proclamation were not issued. Well, this is where the debate starts. That still exists today. Why did he not free all the slaves? Well, he was a very prudent president who understood that striking a balance between, because, matter of fact, not only the southern states, but some northern states, and certainly some states that were fighting on the side of the Union, still had slaves. Even in the upper north, where the financial markets were supporting through slavery, through money and finances, and counting the dollars and cents that were being made by the labor of slaves. And so he did this to give them a 100-day period to say, as long as you keep fighting on the side of the Union, then you can keep your slaves until the end of the war, and then we will sort this out. Everybody will bring the Union back together, and we will reestablish a fair and equitable society where all men are created equal. And so this is where this debate just rages on by some historians and philosophers that Abraham Lincoln did not intend and did not enslave and free the slaves. As a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass said through the proclamation, Abraham Lincoln wrote the proclamation, but General Grant made it a fact. And he said that because he said he's making it a fact through the process of Reconstruction. Now, here's where we stop. Here is where we come to Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth, believe it or not, is the holiday because news of the Emancipation Proclamation issued on the first day of January 1863 did not arrive in the southernmost state of Texas until 2 years later, when General Gordon Granger and his soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, and restated the Emancipation Proclamation and read his own General Order Number 3, which basically was saying, I am here to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. I just happen to have a copy of it right here. General Order Number 3, Headquarters, District of Texas, Galveston, Texas, June the 19th, 1865. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves all absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and that the connection heretofore existing between them becomes now that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere, by the order of Major General Granger. And so this basically lets the Texans know that the Emancipation Proclamation and the war is over. The emancipation of the slaves is guaranteed, and he's there to enforce that. What you do see is that he is establishing a new order that we now have a relationship of employer and hired labor. Well, Texans are just excited, exuberant that they're now free. Many of them eventually will leave Texas. What he was saying in his general order is that he wants them to stay there, to find a new working dynamic and find labor and start finding out what it means to be a free man and work for your freedom and your labor and your livelihood. Of course, this starts the evolution of the Juneteenth holiday, which after the Emancipation Proclamation, most people were celebrating the emancipation and calling it Jubilee Day because they didn't even know that there were slaves in Texas who had not been free. Now, once those slaves in Texas decided that they did not want to stay there and start migrating across the country, then they brought this idea in that migration across the rest of the country. And gradually, over time, this Jubilee transformed into Juneteenth. Now, the real purpose of this celebration also transformed. What they were doing, not only to celebrate with fireworks and music and food, they were intent on finding out what it meant to become active citizens, how they could participate in the social, economic, and political process. They started organizing to establish and fight for new amendments coming to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, freedom or citizenship for the black man. In the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law and the right to vote. And so these Juneteenth celebrations were intense with people organizing, trying to establish their right to vote. Black men, businessmen coming and showing their wares and saying, we are now, we have our own businesses, blacksmiths, doctors, all these sorts of things. We have new churches establishing themselves. We no longer have to have the slave master reading the Bible to us. We will read the Bible for ourselves. We are now have our own schools and we are building schools. So all of these things were a showcase in the Juneteenth celebration. Now, unfortunately, Reconstruction was a very tedious and process that eventually fell apart. Under President Grant, the funding and the political will, the public support of Reconstruction also meant that Juneteenth would be greatly affected, because under Reconstruction, where you had Union soldiers throughout the country, especially in the South, supporting, protecting African Americans in their process to get back involved and become a part of the political process, these Union soldiers started to wither away, fade away. Confederates started Jim Crow laws. The Ku Klux Klan was formed to intimidate colored people, free people, from exercising their rights for the First Amendment, to protest in a free space. And so anything like Juneteenth would have had to go underground, and many of the Juneteenth celebrations that were formerly out in the open now went basically underground, because they didn't want to bring attention to themselves or their methods about what they were trying to do. And so over the years, the Juneteenth holiday has had to struggle in reestablishing itself in America as part of the narrative of what slavery and the end of slavery means to this country. And of course, as we in Reconstruction, and then we come into the civil rights movement of the 60s, these again and again, the free movement, the free exercise of freedom in America is challenged, and therefore any celebration of Black history has been challenged. But thankfully now, we have a period where the Juneteenth holiday has become very significant. As a matter of fact, there are actually about 13 states that have become Juneteenth an official holiday, and I certainly am excited that this June of 2021 has been one of the most prosperous that I have seen since I've been doing living history. Back in 10, 15 years ago, I might have been doing one Juneteenth event, whereas now this entire week leading up to Juneteenth, I have multiple events across the country, and people are celebrating Juneteenth, and the whole country is now understanding what Juneteenth really means in the narrative of American history. So thank you all for sticking with me through this conversation. Certainly, I tried to give you what I refer to as an unabridged narrative of slavery and the end of slavery in America. But I didn't cover all the facts. I may give you some tidbits that you might want to open a book or visit a library and find out more details about it. But this is the time when, if I can quote, if I can quote Mark Twain, he said, "Don't let your schooling get in the way of your education." Meaning there's learning outside of the classroom. Meaning that education is a lifelong process. And with the advent of technology, for the young people that might be listening, you don't even have to go to the library. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wish your parents had the World Book Encyclopedia. With this technology that we hold now right in the palm of our hand, you can ask Siri, Siri, what is Juneteenth? And the entire history will be right there before you. So, thank you again, patrons of the Chesterfield Public Library System. Thank you for inviting me, and happy Juneteenth. I am Nathan Richardson. Have a great day.